way. Okay, so um, so today I'm going to talk about the integrative approach to aging and other neurodegenerative diseases, because essentially aging is a neurodegenerative disease that we all go through, whether or not we ever get Parkinson's or not. You know, when my day job is a neurosurgeon. You can see my diploma from neurosurgery school here. But as I learned over the years, there was an additional X factor that I saw in my patients that really separated those that really did well in the long run versus those that really struggled with their Parkinson's disease. And so for my own health, became certified in anti-aging medicine. And as I learned about this, I realized I could bring this to my patients with movement disorders in order to try to optimize their health. This is an example of what I mean by that X factor. So here you see a patient that is obviously in very good shape, running a triathlon, very lean, very muscular, a sort of paragon of health. But if you notice in his upper chest, there are two little bulges. If the patient has undergone deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's. So, being infirm and having Parkinson's disease are not mutually inclusive things. On the left, some of you might recognize this. This is Jack LaLanne. He was the original fitness guru of the United States. Here's a picture of him at 80 years old. You can see he's very, very fit. On the same side, on the other side, you see a picture of another 80-year-old gentleman who clearly is very bent over, is weak looking. And in fact, if you look in the lower right-hand corner of the original wood carvings of Parkinson's disease, this patient or this person looks a lot like this wood carving of a patient with Parkinson's disease. Now, one of the biggest fallacies that people are given about their health is that it's really in your genes, and that you really don't have a lot of sort of choice as to whether you're going to be the guy on the left or the guy on the right. But the truth is, largely you get to choose which path you go down. And this is what I mean by nature versus nurture. There's only a 0.1% difference in DNA amongst individual humans. So the likelihood that this 0.1% difference is the thing that makes somebody a Jack LaLanne or somebody that's very firm is really unlikely. However, there is another factor about genes that are at play here called epigenetics. And these are the environmental factors that change the expression of our genes. This integrative approach seeks to harness this knowledge of epigenetics so that you can play the cards of genes that you're given in the best way possible. The integrative approach holds that there is a common set of enemies of aging, and that through the use of nutraceuticals, lifestyle change, and hormone optimization, we can attack these common enemies. So what are the common enemies? Well, the first one, most important, is inflammation. Inflammation has now been linked to many, if not all, of the diseases that are commonly associated with aging, as well as other neurodegenerative conditions such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. In fact, so integral is inflammation to the aging process that many researchers are now calling it inflammaging, sort of recognizing the integral role of inflammation with these processes. Now, what is inflammation? Well, inflammation is a localized protective tissue response to injury. And in medical school, it's associated, or we're told it's associated with four Latin terms: dolor, which means pain; calor, which means warmth; tumor, which means swelling, and functiolysa, which is loss of function. So when you sprain your ankle, there is a localized protective tissue response. Your ankle hurts, it gets swollen, it gets red, it gets hot, but it's there for a reason, that inflammation. That begins the healing process. So when you're actually responding to an acute injury with inflammation, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. But what happens when the inflammation is chronic and widespread? Well, there are these things inside your cells called mitochondria. And mitochondria, you can think of them as the little power plants of your cells. That's like the little Con Edison in each and every one of our cells. It turns out that these mitochondria are extremely susceptible to damage from inflammation. So as a result, if these mitochondria get damaged, the energy of the cells is diminished, and the cells, as a result, have dysfunction. What happens is there's a vicious cycle that inflammation sets up. Inflammation occurs, and inflammation creates a process called free radical production. Essentially, these are chemical molecules in your body that have an unpaired electron. And these unpaired electron molecules can wreak havoc on all sorts of molecules in your body. In particular, these are the things that damage mitochondria. The mitochondria die, the cells die because they don't have enough energy, they release messengers that create more inflammation. And so thus we see the second pillar of the aging process, which is oxidative stress. The third thing is something called insulin resistance. One of the consequences of inflammation, and I've already discussed this, is that chemical messengers are produced that affect other cells. These are called cytokines. And that these inflammatory messengers interfere with insulin activity, which can lead to insulin resistance. So what is essentially insulin resistance? Insulin resistance is your body's inability to respond appropriately with a certain amount of insulin that your body produces. Like any other machinery, if you use too much of it, it gets worn out. The same thing happens here with the receptors of insulin. If you use too much insulin for a long period of time, the receptors become less attuned to insulin, and your body has to create more and more insulin to get the same effects. But the consequence of that insulin getting higher and higher and higher is an increased inflammation and oxidative stress throughout the body. And every one of these diseases of aging, coronary and cerebral vascular disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and most forms of cancer all have at their very essence inflammation, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance as their common pathways. But how is this relevant to those of you with movement disorders? Well, for the example of Parkinson's disease, we know that mitochondrial damage is heavily implicated in the selective neuronal loss in Parkinson's disease. In fact, the little pathological features of patients with Parkinson's disease, these so-called Lewy bodies, are abnormal proteins that are associated with mitochondrial dysfunction. Furthermore, one of the more devastating complications of Parkinson's disease is the so-called Parkinson's dementia. And if you are insulin resistant or you have type 2 diabetes, you're more than 2 times more likely to get Parkinson's dementia than a patient with Parkinson's that does not have insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. So why is, for instance, this part of the brain that creates dopamine particularly vulnerable to oxidative stress? So on the upper left-hand corner is a part of the midbrain that includes the substantia nigra. The slice of brain on the right with the black stripe in it is a normal substantia nigra. It's literally called black substance. This is where dopamine is normally made in the brain. On the left, you can see this black stripe is quite a bit paler. This is the result of a patient with Parkinson's disease. So why should this part of the brain be so susceptible to oxidative stress? Well, it turns out, one of the cofactors that are necessary to create dopamine in the brain is iron. And iron, what happens to iron when you leave it outside to the elements? It rusts. Rust is just a form of oxidative stress. So in essence, your brain is rusting when you have Parkinson's disease. The bottom line, the thing that I really want you to kind of wrap your head around is that Parkinson's disease can just be thought of as an accelerated aging of a small area of the brain. In fact, most people, if they were to suddenly become 150 years old or 200 years old, everybody would eventually develop the disease of Parkinson's disease. So all Parkinson's disease is as if a small part of your brain got a little bit older faster than the rest of you. The same thing can be seen in Alzheimer's disease. The plaques are indicative of oxidative stress, and the cells and the brain cells in Alzheimer's disease are so insulin resistant that some researchers in Alzheimer's disease are calling it type 3 diabetes. So one of the things that I encourage people to understand is that there are lab tests that you can do on a yearly basis that look at your own inflammation levels in your body that can give you a clue as to what you need to work on in order to optimize your health. 3 of these tests are the C-reactive protein, the homocysteine level, and the vitamin D level. So once we now know that there are these common pathways of aging, these common enemies, what can we do about it? Well, one approach is to optimize your nutraceutical intake. And so here is a primer about what supplements and vitamins can do for aging and Parkinson's disease. And in essence, every one of the nutraceuticals that I recommend to patients do one of 3 things: reduce inflammation, support your mitochondrial energy, or promote insulin sensitivity. As you can imagine, if those are the common pathways of aging, each one of these nutraceuticals can do something against it. This is like a core group of nutraceuticals. Don't worry about writing this down. We can get you this at a later date. But each one of these, as you can see, have different effects on inflammation, insulin sensitivity, and mitochondrial support. And to just show you that I'm a practice what I preach kind of guy, these are the amount of vitamins I take with each and every meal. So, you know, the unfortunate thing is that these vitamins are a little bit poorly bioavailable, so you have to kind of take large dosages of them to reach dosages that actually have a meaningful effect. But here what you see is what I take myself. As I said, these vitamins orally are poorly bioavailable. It's one of the reasons why there's a lack of evidence in some studies, because very often these studies are done where either they pick very low dosages or they just expect patients to eat the vitamins 30% of the time. And it just doesn't work that way. You really have to be consistent. You have to have consistently high dosages. Otherwise, you're not going to see the impacts. Also, one thing to note is that some of these vitamins do interact with Parkinson's disease meds. And so you just have to work together with your neurologist to do this. For an example, B complex vitamins at higher dosages may enhance L-DOPA metabolism, which could affect the dosages. The second pillar of approach is lifestyle, living your way to optimal health. And there are really 2 essential elements of this: nutrition and reducing stress. So Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, very early on understood that food was medicine and medicine was food. In fact, probably your diet is the single most important thing that you do every single day that has an impact on your health. And over the years, there are aspects of different cultures' diet that have demonstrated significant changes in health. For instance, the Japanese diet, in fact, shows a far less degree of certain vascular issues such as heart and cardiovascular and cerebral vascular disease. The Mediterranean diet also can reduce these things. Some people have now begun to experiment with so-called caloric restriction. And then finally, the French paradox. For years, the French would smoke, they would eat butter and cheese, but for some reason they just didn't develop the kind of heart disease. Now that French paradox is somewhat no longer there because they've adopted certain diets that we have been giving them, and I will explain to that in a minute. The thing about nutrition is that there's really very poor education for patients with Parkinson's disease out there. And why is that? Well, it's just because we don't taught anything about nutrition in medical school. So the first thing that people have to understand is what is the concept of an essential nutrient? An essential nutrient is one that your body cannot make from other building block of nutrients, which means that you have to eat it in order for your body to be able to be healthy. So these are things that your body can't biochemically create from other building blocks. There are essential amino acids or proteins, and there are essential fats that you have to eat. The one thing that most patients are completely bewildered by is that there is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. In fact, a human body can completely live very healthily without eating a single exogenous carbohydrate, which is a sugar and a starch. Consequently, which is very interesting, carbohydrate as a nutrient is the largest stimulator of insulin in your body. And remember what I said to you, the more insulin you use leads to a greater degree of insolence. The more insulin in your body results in more inflammation in your body. And the more insulin in your body results in more fat around your middle. Insulin as a hormone is the chief hormone. There's only one hormone that controls how fat you are, and that's insulin. If you have a low insulin signal in your body, you simply can't develop a gut. It's impossible. So that's the other thing that people don't understand. And once they get that concept into it, you can actually make real changes in your lifestyle that's going to have a real impact in your lives. So I'm sure you guys are probably thinking, well, wait a minute, for like the last 40 years, all my doctor has been telling me is that if I eat cholesterol and saturated fat, I'm going to die. I'm going to die of heart disease. And believe it or not, there's a little bit of a fallacy about this piece of knowledge. So where did this come from? This came from a doctor by the name of Ancel Keys, who was the first president of the AMA. Okay? And why did this happen? Well, in 1950 or so, our sitting president, Eisenhower, had a heart attack. And it was really the first time in the American public consciousness that the concept of a heart attack really entered into public health. Before that time, people really didn't talk about heart attacks as being a significant impact in health. And so all of a sudden, basically, heart disease really was on the minds of people. Well, Ancel Keys very shortly afterwards published in the Journal of Mount Sinai a study that you see on the left. And it looked at the rate of deaths from heart disease in countries right after World War II. And what he found right here, and it's a pretty impressive data point, that the more fat a particular country ate, the higher the rate of deaths from heart disease. And it was this study that literally started the entire premise that cholesterol and fat results in heart disease. There's only one problem with this study. He cheated. He didn't take all of the countries that were available in the data pool. He cherry-picked the data from these 22 countries in order to fit his premise that cholesterol killed you. If you actually take all of the countries, the relationship between fat and deaths is completely and utterly non-existent. So What about cholesterol and saturated fat in your blood? One thing that you need to keep in mind is that cholesterol as a molecule is literally the building block of every cell in your body. It's like the brick of every cell in your body. So, how could the basic building block of your body be poisonous to you? That doesn't make any sense to anybody with a single degree of logic. And every study that has attempted to demonstrate a causal relationship between blood cholesterol and heart disease has actually failed. In fact, when they actually look at patients when they get up in their 60s and above, the higher your cholesterol, the less likely you're going to die from all causes over a 10-year period. So the more cholesterol you're actually rolling around in your body is actually protective against all forms of death. Because one of the things that COVID has taught us is that a heart attack isn't the only way you can die. In fact, they looked at patients with COVID, and the lower cholesterol patients actually did worse with COVID than higher cholesterol, because cholesterol is also an immune molecule as well. So it's not cholesterol that's going to kill you. There's something else. Okay? What is that smoking gun? Inflammation. Inflammation in conjunction with higher cholesterol is a problem. So what about my Lipitor? Well, it turns out that statins do lower your cholesterol. There's no question about it. If you take a statin, your blood cholesterol levels will go down. And they finally have shown that statins do lower heart disease. But they do so not as a function by the cholesterol lowering mechanism, but because these statins are powerfully anti-inflammatory. However, there's a funny thing about these studies. While statins will reduce your chance of dying with heart disease, they do nothing in terms of your overall mortality. So in other words, yes, your heart disease goes down just by a little bit, but all of your other chances of death go up a tiny little bit to compensate. So why should that be? Well, it's because statins, unfortunately, also increase your insulin resistance, which sets you up for mortality from all the other diseases that I just described. So one of the ways that we can address this is by addressing our diet. Now, one diet in particular is very, very, very intriguing for patients with movement disorders. It's the so-called ketogenic diet. And many people think that they know what a ketogenic diet is, but it's one of the most maligned and misunderstood diets that are a part of the American sort of public consciousness of health. It is a high-fat, moderate protein, low carbohydrate diet. So it's about 70% fat, about 25% protein, and about 5 to 10% carbohydrates. If you switch the fat and carbohydrate, that's the standard American diet, where it's about 70% carbohydrates. One of the things that the ketogenic diet does for everybody of aging is it reduces your body fat, and it significantly reduces the inflammation in your body, and it significantly reduces insulin resistance. Why? Because you're not using as much insulin. Because remember, carbohydrates are the thing that creates insulin, not fat. In fact, there are patients now that have been shown that have type 2 diabetes and actually have been quote unquote cured from their type 2 diabetes by adopting a ketogenic diet. Why is this more important for patients with Parkinson's disease? Because there's another, in fact, really important effect of the ketogenic diet. Ketogenic diet means that your body creates a molecule called a ketone body. And a ketone body is an alternative nutrient for your brain. So your brain can run on glucose or carbohydrates, it can run on fats, and it can especially run on ketone bodies. And there are evidence from animal and human studies that these ketone bodies are in fact neuroprotective. They protect neurons from dying. And patients with Parkinson's disease already have lost at least 80% of their dopaminergic cells. And so this ketogenic diet may represent a symptomatic and disease-modifying activity that patients can engage in to help modify their disease. Let's now move over to lifestyle changes. Stress is a big deal. It's especially after this year, everybody now is probably intimately related to stress. But essentially what stress does to the body is it increases a molecule called cortisol. And cortisol, in a very short-term way, is a protective molecule. But when the cortisol is ongoing, it reduces your muscle mass, it increases your body fat, and more importantly, it results in increased insulin resistance. The bottom line is that while this cortisol molecule was designed to help with inflammation, if you use it too much, you decrease your ability to control ongoing inflammation. Exercise. The only entity proven to change the course of Parkinson's disease is exercise. There is no other therapy that yet we have proven to show that it changes the course of the disease. There are two types of exercise, aerobic and resistance training. Now, mostly when I ask patients, do you exercise? They say, sure, I go for a walk, or I walk on the treadmill, or I go jogging. I am going to tell you here straight up that after the age of essentially 40, aerobic exercise is the pound for pound, the least useful form of exercise for an aging physiology. If you are spending your precious moments doing exercise and you're only doing aerobic exercise, you're kind of really not doing all that you can. You're kind of not spending your time most efficiently. The most important type of exercise is resistance training, building your muscles. Nothing more is important in terms of your activities of daily living. And this has been proven when they've looked at the various forms of exercise, looking at death from all causes. And really the only exercise form that actually improves longevity is resistance training. So you gotta lift weights. You have to lift weights to be optimally healthy. Another lifestyle thing is both meditation and sleep. Both of these things are your body's way of decreasing cortisol. Most people really don't know a lot about sleep. They don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. If they have sleep disturbance, they kind of, quote, live with it. It's really, really bad. And obviously Parkinson's disease, sleep disturbance is actually a part of the disease itself. And so this is really important. Another good way to learn meditation, which is a great way to help with this, is the transcendental meditation. There are other forms of meditation that are good out there. The reason why I recommend transcendental meditation, it was designed for Westerners, and it's an easy way for Westerners to pick us up. There's a website there. You can go. You can learn how to do it. The last thing I want to talk about is hormones. And your hormonal milieu, the hormones in your body, are sort of the basic thing that ties everything together. As we get older, your hormones begin to sort of get out of whack. And when the hormones are too out of whack, even if you address the diet, you address all of these other things that I've told you, you're kind of like working with like a couple of weights tied on your ankles. And so I want to show you what that means. So there's this concept called pause that's about the hormonal systems in the body. Everybody, especially women, understand the concept of menopause, which happens to women at the 5th and 6th decades of life. But men go through a pause as well, a little bit earlier, and your thyroid system as well as your growth hormone system all go through these pauses. And as these hormones get lower and lower, you actually have a harder time optimizing your health. And you can see all these pauses are associated like with all of these things that I just talked about, insulin resistance, decreased lean muscle mass, inflammation, etc. So you have to regulate your hormones in order to optimize your health as you get older. Now, up until about the 90s, women regularly got hormone replacement when they got into menopause, and then it stopped. And it stopped because there was this study in the 1990s called the Women's Health Initiative. And what they found was with the hormone replacement that was the sort of the standard, instead of seeing things that they thought were going to be good, they actually showed increased heart attacks, strokes, blood clots, and breast cancer. Yes, there were fewer fractures and decreased colon cancer, which is what they expected, but they didn't expect all these other things. Well, why? For some reason, well, not for some reason, there are good reasons. The hormones that were standard therapy at the time were not bioidentical hormones. They were sort of proprietary molecules that drug companies could sell and patent and things of that nature. They didn't use bioidentical hormones because there's no patent on bioidentical hormones. So the studies didn't use them. And when the studies have been repeated in Europe with bioidentical hormones, this increased heart attacks and strokes did not in fact occur. So if you use bioidentical hormones, you can actually regulate your hormones as a woman and actually avoid these symptoms that stop the hormone replacement. Laboratory assessment can be done on a yearly basis to look at all of these factors that I discussed, and etc. So the healthier you are, as with Parkinson's disease, the longer you will be in the long run. And I hope at least I was able to show you today that much of this is in your control, even if you do have Parkinson's disease. So that's it. I'm happy to take some questions at this time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, that was really enlightening. I don't see anything in the chat, but that doesn't mean people don't have questions. Do you guys want to, if people have questions, you can put them in the chat. You can call them out. That's, I think, fine. Anybody have any questions? There was lots and lots of information there.
Yeah, that was really great.
Anybody?
So I think the keto diet's pretty confusing. Is there a good resource guide you would recommend?
Yeah, there's a book called The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living. The two authors are, the last names are Volek, V-O-L-E-K, and Finney, P-H-I-N-N-E-Y. That's a good, I mean, there are many books, but I like that one.
Okay, thank
And
you.
I see it was put into the chat. Thank you, Meredith.
Yes.
Much appreciate that. That was good. So it's in the chat. Joe just had a question. How can someone make an appointment with Dr. Coppell for an anti-aging appointment?
Okay, so here's the thing about this, is that right now we're just beginning our project to do this. I'll be very upfront. Your insurance company really won't pay for much of this stuff. So it's quite a bit of money that have to be paid outright to do this appropriately. That's not my fault, but it is something that definitely has a significant outlay of funds on a monthly basis, maybe up to, $500-600 a month ongoing, and the initial workup is a few grand. So it's a little hard for me to just say, come on down, because people have to understand that, unfortunately, insurance companies are not really interested in keeping you optimally healthy. They'll just pay for your meds when you get sick.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Dr. Coppell, do you have any offices on the island, even for the DBS?
I don't. That's a good question, and
I may not be asking for myself, but I'm asking for others who I know.
Well, we're in the process of having one of our neurologists set up there so that you can see them. Obviously, to have the surgery done, you have to have it done at Mount Sinai on Mount Sinai West. But the good news is that there are programming features now that you can get programmed close to home. So my goal, if you're interested in our center evaluating you for DBS, I would just reach out to our program manager. Meredith can type the number, and you can reach out to us, and we can kind of work on you that way. But we're in the process of getting a neurologist out there on a regular basis.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
The book that you described, does that will that help determine or outline a good ketogenic diet? You know, what's in there, what's not in there, what's bad, what's good?
Yep, it sure would. It sure would.
Okay, fine.
And it's a really easy to understand book. I like it a lot.
Okay.
Great.
Does it have pictures in the middle?
What about the fact that protein has a bad effect on the absorption of L-DOPA for a lot of people? Can that diet still be
Yes, because
used?
moderate protein. Here's the deal. If you avoid protein, your Parkinson's meds might work a little bit better, but you're going to fall apart in the long run. It's not a great strategy about avoiding protein. You may need to time your protein throughout the day, but unless you get unless you get the correct amount of protein per day, you're just going to lose muscle. And I promise you, no amount of Parkinson's meds is going to fix that.
Ugh.
Okay. Someone else?
Looks like we can tank up on ice cream, huh?
Well, as long as there's no sugar in that ice cream.
Aha.
So I actually make my own ketogenic ice cream. I got myself an ice cream maker, and I make my own ice cream there are certain sweeteners that you can use that are much better than sugar.
Got it. And they are?
Yeah, I was going to say like.
My two favorite ones are something called allulose, which is a type of sugar that isn't absorbed in the body, and a second one which is called erythritol. Brand name is Truvia, Truvia.
Yeah.
But there are some other ones that are okay as well. Monk fruit is one that's pretty good as well.
I use that.
Super.
Yep.
Yeah, and monk fruit you can get in any grocery store now. They all have it. It's very popular.
You get any of these on Amazon, any of these.
What about stevia?
Stevia is a part of that. Truvia is a combination of erythritol and stevia.
Okay.
So, there's sometimes, each one of these have a slightly different flavor profile. So when you combine them, it's a little bit better. There's also another product that's already like a mix of these different things called Wondrose. It's by a company. I forgot the name of the company, but it's a good product. Wondrose, Wondrose.
Change the topic for a second to do with the osteoporosis and women with PD.
Yeah. What about it?
Who would I talk to about? I keep losing a lot of bone mass.
Yeah, because your estrogen levels are very, very low, and
Right.
it's really impossible to keep a good bone mass without having normal estrogen levels. It's just impossible.
Now, the question is, the doctors want to put me on, of course, medicine. I don't know what kind to take, or should I take it?
You got to find yourself. There are a lot of doctors that are stuck in archaic terminologies, and you're just going to have to. If you go to the eighth, well, there. there are, if you Google around for hormone replacement in women, you might be able to find some in your neighborhood that you might be able to find somebody.
Okay, I didn't know if you had a specific type of doctor that I would have to go to.
No, there are a number of doctors all around that do this, but many doctors don't. And if you ask them, your doctor, well, why won't you put it on me? And they say, well, because there are studies that showed cancer. And then you say to them, well, what about bioidentical hormones? They're either going to lie to you and say they know, or they're going to say, I don't know, and kind of blow you off. That's usually
Are these doctors gynecologists or other types of doctors?
usually other types of doctors.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Someone else?
It's a lot to digest. That's all I have to say. The information.
It's a lot of information, a lot of good information. Yes, a lot to digest.
Yeah.
So
Well,
true.
I think that, people have to sort of begin to ask themselves the question, for 40 years, they said, stop eating fat and saturated fat, and heart disease continues to rise and obesity continues to go up. So you gotta, at some point, say to yourself, look, something doesn't make any sense here. And the reason why it doesn't make sense, because it didn't make sense to begin with. But unfortunately, in medicine, once the cow's out of the barn, it's a little hard to get it back into the barn.
I'm glad you pointed out about resistance training.
Yeah.
Really the most important form. If people are just walking on a treadmill, I always say to patients, walking is a form of locomotion. It's not an exercise. You got to lift weights. Got to lift weights.
Uh,
That's right. Off to the gym. You see?
But now I have to go back to the drawing boards because I recently only do 1.5 miles upstairs so that I have time for all these exercises that she gave me.
But that's different. It's also resistance too.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope this was useful, guys. Thank you for.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you
Dr.
very much.
Yep.
There was a lot of good information.
Thank you.
fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Information. Thank you so much,
Fantastic,
everyone, for
fantastic.
coming. Thank you,
Thank you.
doctor. We really
Thank you,
appreciate it.
everyone.
All right,
Thank you.
everybody. Take care.
Take care.
Afternoon,
you.
everybody.
So you have to get